Mr. Keith.
Good morning, my lady. My lady, the first witness today is Dame Kate Bingham. Could you be sworn, please?
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Dame Kate, could you commence your evidence, please, by giving the inquiry your full name?
Hello, my name is Kate Bingham, or Catherine Elizabeth Bingham.
All right, thank you very much. Dame Kate, thank you very much for attending and for assisting the inquiry, not least by the provision of your witness statement, INQ 30474406 of October 24. I'd like to start, please, your evidence by asking you a few questions about your professional background, if I may. You graduated from Oxford with a first-class degree in biochemistry. You worked as a management consultant. You completed an MBA at Harvard, and then you went into the world of venture capital and private equity with Schroeder Ventures. And out of that, you then pursued SV Health Investors, your venture capital firm, specializing in particular in building and investing in biotech companies. And I think you were, at the time of the pandemic, and remain a managing partner at SV Health Investors.
Correct.
Your role in the pandemic was, of course, centred around your position as the chair of the vaccine taskforce. It is self-evident that, to a very large extent, the vaccine programme in which the VTF played such an important role was a success. It is also self-evident that there were very considerable individual successes achieved in relation to therapeutics, dexamethasone being the most obvious one, but a number of repurposed drugs were authorised for use and a number of new drugs were developed, discovered and rolled out. The role of the VTF, therefore, requires considerable examination because it's vital in the inquiry's view that what worked well is embedded into the system for the future, and what didn't go quite so well can be focused upon and improved. The VTF commenced its life by way of being officially launched on the 17th of April 2020. But there were initially two parts to it, were there not? There was an external advisory board and a programme board. What was the main feature of the external advisory board in terms of its constitution? It appears to have been made up with membership of manufacturing experts, bioindustrial specialists, vaccine scientists, and a number of external professionals. Is that right?
That's correct. So Patrick Vallance created that external advisory board in order to bring some specific expertise into Whitehall. So I think until that point, Whitehall had been taking charge, and when I think it became clear that those skills and capabilities were not there, he then brought together this group of, as you say, clinicians, industry people, manufacturing experts, regulatory, and they were there to help advise the team within BAYS, the business department, on all aspects of securing vaccines.
And then the programme board, by contrast, comprised the civil service element, if you like, of the original form of the VTF. I think it was led by Alex Jones of BAYS. And in due course, the external advisory group was brought to an end and the two parts were amalgamated into what became the body that you chaired, and you were formally appointed on the 6th of May 2020.
Yes, they didn't quite amalgamate. The VTF was relaunched with a steering group which was part comprised with industry experts that I chose and part comprised actually with new civil servants that were brought in for specific expertise. The expert advisory group remained on the sides for a bit, and the BAYS team, I think, then was rebuilt.
When you arrived, you say in your book that you became aware that Bayes had handed over responsibility for one part of what became the VTF Group's functions to a management consultancy firm. In the context of, and I'll ask you more about this in a moment, of the importance of bringing in external expertise, why did you take the view that using external management consultants was the wrong approach?
Because that seemed to be a default move within the civil service, and to bring in people supposedly with expertise, although certainly not the level of expertise that we brought through the VTF team. And what it means is you've got a civil service that never builds that level of expertise internally, because they are always outsourcing it and relying on external experts. And the whole reason that the VTF was created was because that expertise and those relationships with industry and that understanding of how to develop, manufacture, regulate and launch a vaccine was not there in government. And the more you outsource it to major management consultancies, the more you're never going to build that capability internally. So I am critical of the rotating seats that we see in Whitehall, and no focus or even recognition of the need to build up that expertise.
And we'll come back in due course to some of the general overarching comments that you make in your book about the civil service approach. It's plain from the paperwork that you demanded a number of conditions be met prior to you taking the role as the chair of the VTF. Just to run through them one by one, you demanded a clear mandate with a direct reporting line to the Prime Minister. Why was that?
Because I felt that if I did not have the authority of the Prime Minister, there was clearly tensions between the Business Department and the Department of Health, and that there would be interference at a ministerial level and from officials if I didn't have a very clear reporting to the PM. And that absolutely was the correct decision and was worth its weight in gold.
A second condition you demanded was that the VTF be located within Bayes, BEIS. Why was that?
Because our job was fundamentally a commercial job, which was to work with manufacturers, industry, to identify the best vaccines, manufacture them, and secure contracts. So this is a commercial discussion, not a how do you actually deploy it in the health system.
And is governmental supervision of the life sciences industry, insofar as it impacts upon government, within Bayes?
Yes.
You demanded the ability to make rapid decisions. You asked for rapid decision-making. Again, why was that?
Because I hadn't worked with government before, but the one thing you know about government is they're incredibly slow.
You asked for the ability to establish a dedicated budget with timelines. Why was that?
Because, again, my understanding was that everything in terms of getting money signed off in government takes a very long time, and you've got to go around all endless departments, and then you go back to Treasury who say no, and then you go around again and you do it again. So the idea was not that we had actually the VTF steering group, we did not have spending authority. We made recommendations, but to the extent we could actually have a dedicated budget from which any contracts could be paid would then again speed up the rate of decision-making and execution of what we were trying to do.
And was that absolutely vital, in fact, to the proper performance of the VTF's functions? And we'll come to that in due course as well. Of perhaps lesser import in the general scheme of things, but nevertheless of considerable interest, you also demanded that you be the chair only for 6 months. You said, I want a 6-month term of office. And you also asked that you be given the ability to sign off on all communications in advance. Because this may reflect on your views on the civil service and on the way in which government went about things. But why did you ask for those two conditions? So
6 months, we'd just raised a new fund. And so I'm a key person in the fund, and if I wasn't part of the fund, our investors could actually suspend the fund, so that it wasn't just for me. I was working pro bono, but it's the entire team and the group I work with. So that I wasn't able to do more than that. And the comms was about the worry about leaks coming out of government.
It's apparent from your statement and from the paperwork that you were put through quite a robust conflict of interest process. is this the sum of it? Your position was examined, in fact, by the DHSC and by the Cabinet Office. You were obliged to declare anything that might conceivably cause a conflict of interest. And in the interest of the government and of what you were doing, did you, in fact, step off a number of boards and committees, and in particular, agree that no fund managed by SV, your company, could or would invest in any Covid-19 vaccine company?
Correct.
And to the detriment of one of your funds, did that fund, in fact, have to pause all divestment and investment for quite a considerable period in relation to the biosciences industry?
Yep, correct. It was a public fund, so that it was its performance was gauged against the index, and because the index had spiked so massively with the COVID vaccines, not being able to participate in that was a problem for them. Yes.
You've referred to the degree of independence that you sought. By and large, were you afforded it?
Yes.
You reported to the Prime Minister ultimately, but VTF remained a formal part of BEIS, and presumably the ministerial accountability line was to Parliament through BEIS.
Correct.
It's obvious that a very great deal of hard work was done and a great deal of time was spent on discharging your functions within VTF. Did that include reporting daily, in the evenings or weekends, to a multitude of ministers and officials?
I set up meetings at 8 o'clock in the morning, 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and that was our ability within the steering group to communicate what we were doing and what progress we'd made. Those meetings became a reporting mechanism as time went on, with more and more officials wanting to join. So I have no idea quite how many joined towards the end of my 6 months, but it was a lot. We had regular catch-ups with Alok Sharma, who was the Minister, Secretary of State for BEIS, and not very regular, but nonetheless catch-ups with Number 10 and the Prime Minister.
There were, in the VTF, a number of external professionals, and in order in part to give them tribute for what they did, given the overarching success of the VTF, they included Ian McCubbin, head of the Bioprocessing Group, Steve Bates from the Bioindustry Association, Maddie McTurnan. Was she a civil servant or was she external?
Maddie's civil servant, but had come through the private sector, a lawyer.
Ruth Todd, who was, I think, head of your
Programmes
process, civil servant or external?
Again, a civil servant, but with a long career in the private sector.
Clive Dix, your deputy?
Phenomenal.
And from where?
Private sector.
And Nick Elliott, your Director General?
Most recently from the private sector, but had a career in the Army and programme management before that.
So, drawing the threads together, it's obvious that the external experience, the industrial expertise was vital to the proper discharge of the VTS job.
Completely.
That's not to say that there isn't a vital role for civil service experience. Was that particularly in relation to contracting, obviously money flows, expenditure, project management, and possibly diplomacy?
Correct. All those 3 things, I think the civil service in our team did really well.
So ultimately, it wasn't a question of the VTF succeeding because it was exclusively staffed by external professionals. It was that collaborative approach from industry and the external professions,
and I might say,
as well as the civil service.
Correct, and plenty of women in the leadership team.
Quite right. There were 3 objectives set for the VTF to secure, very broadly, to secure vaccines for the United Kingdom, to ensure that vaccines were distributed equitably around the world, and thirdly, to make the UK more resilient in dealing with a future pandemic. It's obviously somewhat uncomfortable to ask for anybody to have to mark their own homework, Dame Kate, but in relation to Goal 1, to secure vaccines for the United Kingdom, do you feel you can say that you succeeded?
Yes.
That goal was to secure vaccines, but part of the VTS functions, it turned out, included the role of identifying, developing and procuring and making available monoclonal antibodies?
Prophylactics for those who couldn't receive vaccine. So actually the first goal was around protecting the UK population.
And in relation to monoclonal antibodies, do you think you succeeded on securing or making available those monoclonal antibodies?
No.
We'll come back to that later. The second goal, to ensure vaccines were distributed equitably around the world. Why, without appearing in any way nationalistic, does it matter in terms of the UK interests that vaccines are distributed elsewhere in the world?
Because, first of all, I think there's an ethical and moral case that the UK and a wealthy country should be contributing to low and middle income countries' health systems. The clinical argument is that for as long as this virus continues to infect people around the world, especially those people who are immunocompromised, so in Africa with HIV, you will continue to get viral mutation, and so then you will get the emergence of potentially more lethal and more infective viruses, which is exactly what we saw. And so the more quickly the global community can actually vaccinate all those people who are vulnerable, the more effective we will be at stemming the impact of the pandemic.
And in that regard, the United Kingdom government had contributed during your time as chair a very large sum of money to the international organisation COVAX. Was it your view that more could have been done nevertheless?
Yes, there was the commitment, but it was very late. So actually, I've got good data to show that we were not even in the top 10 of countries donating vaccine. In 21 when it matters. So yes, maybe by the end of 22 we had started donating more, but by then it was too late. So that it really matters that we play an active role at the time when it matters rather than afterwards.
It's important though to note that AstraZeneca, UK company, of course, made the Oxford adenoviral vaccine available at cost and was, relatively speaking, quite a cheap vaccine, was it not?
It was cheap, and it was the vaccine that will have saved more lives than any other around the world. And
to his credit, did the Prime Minister make plain to you that in addition to securing vaccines for the United Kingdom and obviously directing himself to the direct interests of our population, he wanted the United Kingdom to be at the forefront of global manufacture and supply in order to be able to spread the beneficial impact of vaccines
He was
globally.
Explicit about that, and that was really important. And the other factor that he was explicit about was people were dying, so he wanted us to act quickly.
And throughout the 6 months that you were in charge of the VTF, did the Prime Minister frequently bang that drum?
Did he frequently?
Bang that drum. Did
Yes.
he constantly make that point?
Yes, he did.
The third goal, very broadly, was to make the UK more resilient in dealing with the future pandemic. How do you feel you did on that?
Very modestly.
Why?
Because we put lots of great plans, recommendations and suggestions in place, and there is no coherent leadership to actually follow through with what we had suggested. So we may get into this in more detail, but there are, different pots of grant money that's available for different things with no overarching leadership, no plan of actually how can we join up what is an incredibly effective bioprocessing industry, in particular in the UK. So this is an industry that came together in February 21, way before the government is even thinking about what to do. And they said, we realise we're the
February
ones...
2020.
Sorry, 2020, we're the ones that are going to have to do the scale up and the manufacturing of vaccines, so we might as well get going because there's no time to be lost. Now, that is an astonishing thing. It was not based on contracts. This was not based on money or anyone asking them to do it. This was the industry coming together and saying, this is how we can help. And so we have an astonishingly collaborative, supportive, generous industry in this country, and yet we're not supporting it with any government-led leadership which has a coherent strategy. So the reason I think we haven't delivered that third goal that the Prime Minister set was not that we haven't tried, but we don't have any ongoing leadership strategy or ability to deliver that strategy within government, because it is not business as usual.
And we'll come back to many of these areas in due course, but broadly speaking, are you dealing there with, or are you referring to the issue of the management and coordination of the funding routes, the management coordination of the clinical trials from the vantage point of the government, of course, and also the issue of onshore manufacturing of both vaccines as well as bulk antibodies?
I'm talking about all of that. So we don't wait in defence to have Russia invade Ukraine to then set up a task force to say, right, what should we be doing? What weapons should we be using? How should we be helping? What should we be doing? What might be coming through in the future? We have a standing capability of experts who are looking at the future to say, what are the new vaccine formats? What are the new potential threats that could be coming? And how can we prepare for that? We don't have that level of capability or long-term thinking in government. So there's lots of well-meaning, good strategies which are itsy-bitsy, bit of money here, and will be allocated out. But there is nothing that brings together the end-to-end manufacturing, discovery, development, scale-up manufacturing, clinical, regulatory, to get to vaccines that can get into people to protect people. And that is what's missing.
Remaining for the moment with the issue of the scope of the VTF, there was quite a difficult issue to be circumnavigated concerning whether or not therapeutics, and in particular, as you said, monoclonal antibodies, should be within the remit of the vaccine task force. We understand that, in fact, at the first meeting on the 11th of May, the agenda referred to your body as the Vaccine and Therapeutics Task Force. How was the issue as to what the remit of the VTF should be resolved?
So therapeutics is obviously my background, so that is the natural area for me to have included in the remit. What I did is what I would always do, which is to go and talk to the people involved, including in industry. And it was quite clear there was open warfare between BEIS and Department of Health. And the recovery trial at that point had been set up. So this is the big master protocol, phase 3 trial that demonstrated dexamethasone. So there was no need for me to have any involvement in that. That was being run beautifully and executed well. So then the question is, well, should we have had oversight on the phase 1 and early phase 2 clinical trials, testing either repurposing medicines or ultimately bringing forward new medicines? Ultimately, it was quite clear that there was no need to do that because there are already too many people probably involved. It wasn't functional, and vaccines was ultimately going to be the route out of the pandemic. So the focus for us was to actually focus solely on vaccines, not to take on therapeutics.
The evidence before the inquiry appears to be that there were considerable tensions between the funders, the officials, the academics, and the industrialists in the sphere of those phase 1 and 2 trials. That there appears to have been a profusion of trials, many of them underpowered, some of them badly recruited, and quite a lot of
just to be clear, that you're talking only about therapeutics, because
I am.
Yes.
I'm only talking about therapeutics there.
Yes, that was the impression I got.
You mentioned the recovery trial, which is a
brilliant
therapeutic trial. And was this ultimately the position that if you had brought the whole caboodle of therapeutics within the remit of the VTF, you might have ended up dividing your attention. You would have been less able to focus ruthlessly on the question of identifying, procuring, and making available vaccines, which of course was your primary goal.
Correct.
We have in the inquiry a number of emails from May in which you debate with Sir Jeremy Farrar, Sir John Bell, Sir Patrick Vallance as he then was, where this issue about the remit of the VTF would end up. Was it your position that you wanted to keep neutralising antibodies, but you were content to allow the remainder to go off to what became the Therapeutics Task Force.
Yes. So I felt strongly that we should have governance over the neutralising antibodies, because there are a portion of people in the UK who are immunocompromised. That means they are unable to mount a protective vaccine response if given a vaccine. So people with HIV, or people going through bone marrow transplantation, or anywhere where you've got basically a dysfunctional immune system. And so I felt correctly that was part of our original mandate, which was to protect the UK, the relevant UK population against SARS-CoV-2. And that wasn't just to protect those people who could respond to a vaccine, but to protect all those people, including the immunocompromised. So yes, that was agreed to be part of our mandate. And as part of that, you've got two different types of antibody. You've got the prophylactic antibody to treat the people who can't mount a vaccine response, but you've also got treatment antibodies. So they're different only really in how long they last.
So Evusheld, for example,
yeah, so
could be
Evusheld was
prophylactically also by way of treatment.
Yes, so Evusheld was designed to have long-acting half-life, so that it could dose every 6 months or longer. The treatment antibodies would have a normal short half-life of a month or so.
All right.
And so that was different, but if we're going to do all the due diligence on it, we should do the diligence together.
But those persons who are sadly immunosuppressed nevertheless would also have benefited from other therapeutics made available, not just monoclonal antibodies. That they might have benefited from small molecule drugs, from anti-inflammatory drugs. If you had taken on board the other types of therapeutics, to the ultimate benefit of those persons who can't take vaccines, might you not have been able to get to a better place to have ensured that therapeutics were made more widely available?
I think we would have done it more quickly, and we might have been more effective, but we would then need to have probably expanded our team a little bit to do that.
All right. In August of 2021, so in fact, after you left, because I think you left the VTF in
December
2020, Charlotte Taylor, who was then the acting director of the Antivirals Task Force, noted in an email that she'd been discussing with Sir Patrick Vallance, then the government's chief scientific advisor, that there appeared to be a limited enthusiasm for prophylactic use across the system, across the government system. And there was considerable debate as to whether or not the government had gone awry in terms of not focusing sufficiently on developing and making available prophylactics. Did you ever get the impression during your time in the VTF that the issue of prophylactic development was being left behind, being made to be a second-class citizen?
I absolutely felt that, yes, from late October 2020.
Did you have any involvement in the appointment or the composition of the Therapeutics Task Force?
No. One of my venture partners, Ruth McKernan, was on the Antivirals Task Force, which ultimately merged in with the Therapeutics Task Force, but that was late 21.
All right, thank you. Another topic now, and we'll come back to the detail of some of those points in due course, but just by way of headline. In your statement, you raised the issue of cooperation with the European Union. And because there was a considerable amount of debate about this topic, I want to ask you some questions about it. In the early stages of 2020, was there a proposal at the European level that there be a European Medicines Agency task force comprising France, United Kingdom and Germany?
Yes, they called it the E3 Alliance initially, and then they expanded it.
To include Italy, Netherlands and Norway, so it became the E6.
Probably more.
As far as you saw it, what was the potential benefit of joining such a European or international task force?
The benefits would have been that we could have shared expertise, shared due diligence, and then used collective bargaining power to secure attractive rights for the access of those vaccines.
And what was the disadvantage?
Disadvantage was the conditions that the European Commission ultimately put. So the European Commission, as soon as they discovered that France, Germany had approached us, because I think it was just 3 to begin with, each one of us had a major vaccine company or drug that was being developed. If you think AZ, Sanofi, and Germany, BioNTech, we could have done a lot. But the European Commission said no, everybody has to be together within the European Commission, and we were still part of Europe in 2020. But the disadvantage was that they said to the UK, because you're leaving, you can't have a seat at the table to agree which vaccines we're going to have. We'll tell you which you can have and when. And by the way, you've got to stop all the work you're doing now on vaccines. So it wasn't very complicated.
You'd already started negotiations. Essentially, you wouldn't have been able to paddle your own vaccines canoe thereafter. You'd have had to
sit at the back
and give way to the European position in terms of which vaccine company was then going to be pursued and how they'd been negotiated with.
Correct.
All right.
But just to be clear, that was not a decision for me. That was a political decision. They asked me what was my views, and my views was it was worth exploring the E3 until that no longer became an opportunity.
But it was obviously the right call.
Yeah, for sure, if those were the conditions.
On the general topic of vaccine procurement, how likely was it at February 2020 that you would be able to identify and assist the development of and negotiate with of a vaccine and negotiate a successful contract with a vaccine manufacturer?
That was a question I asked at the expert advisory meeting in my first one in April 2020. And the experts there said they thought that any vaccine candidate that was in clinical trials in 2020, already in clinical trials, had a 15% chance of success, and anything that had not yet even entered clinical trials would be less than 10%. And over and above that, the leading vaccine candidates were mRNA and adeno-based vaccines. They had never been approved for any product ever in any indication. So there'd been no regulatory success with those formats. The quickest that a vaccine had ever been developed before was 5 years with mumps, and that was 50 years ago when the regulatory standards were much lower than they are now. And elderly, who were the most at risk from SARS-CoV-2, mount a poor response generally to vaccines. So if you take all of that as a whole, the chances of this succeeding was very low.
And can I just seek to put some human flesh on the bones? You referred very quickly to mRNA and adenoviral. The mRNA, is that the messenger RNA ribonucleic acid vaccines, which in fact turned out to be the Pfizer and the Moderna, Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines? And the adenoviral, is that the Oxford vector vaccine?
And J&J, Janssen.
Janssen and Janssen, but the AstraZeneca
Correct.
vaccine. Could we have, please, INQ 000506824, please, on the screen? This is a presentation dated the 7th of May. Your initial thoughts. And if we just have a quick look at page 3, please, we'll see that you describe the challenge as being harder than Everest. There is no vaccine for any coronavirus, full stop. And had there been a vaccine developed for HIV, for example?
No, they're unsuccessfully. And the important point about coronaviruses is we first knew about them 10 years before. So we had SARS-1 and then we had MERS. So in actual fact, we had a history of failure of developing vaccines against coronaviruses, but actually that was quite helpful because it had built up a capability and a knowledge of coronaviruses so that it was much quicker to then go and develop a vaccine the next time. And with HIV, it mutates so quickly that that's been proven to be very difficult to develop a vaccine against.
So there had been considerable research and development done on both mRNA vaccines and the adenoviral vector technology, and funding, a lot of funding had been pumped into the system for general research and development, had it not?
Yes.
All right. But nothing had actually been produced in terms of being developed to authorization stage.
Correct.
Right. You refer to, in the middle of the page, to needing multiple different shots on goal because of the very high attrition rate. What was the very high attrition rate to? Was that a reference to the likelihood, the very high likelihood of failure of an individual vaccine pursuit?
Yes.
Right, so you needed to try to pursue as many vaccines of as many different types as you could.
Not quite. I don't think, because I've seen some of the witness statements that say we had to pursue everything we possibly could. That's not right. We had to pursue the best and the most likely to succeed. That doesn't mean everyone. So that what we originally thought, this I might just remark, is day 2. So I was called on the 6th of May, and this is a presentation on the 7th of May. So what we initially thought, and we were fingers in the air, we thought we might need 10 to 12 vaccine candidates in order to assume that one would succeed based on that, 10% likelihood of success. But actually, when we did the work and the due diligence, and we really got under the skin of the candidates that were out there, we realised actually we did not need as many vaccines as that to really cover our bases so that we had access to all the different formats and the different characteristics that we were seeking.
So you sought the most promising vaccines representing each of the 4, by and large, different formats.
Exactly.
The second thing that you did was to make the decision that you had to purchase at risk. What was that, and why was that so important?
Because there was going to be very limited supply of vaccines, and these companies, many of which were small companies, had to scale up to population scale quantities. Every country needed vaccine to protect their vulnerable populations, and there was going to be an adequate supply. So what we had to do, the UK but other countries around the world, was to put money up and help fund those vaccine companies to actually invest in the manufacturing scale-up and bulk manufacturing, and also to run the clinical trials before we knew whether or not these vaccines would work. Because if we only invested in manufacturing after we knew the vaccine would work, you then had another year. So it's highly unusual that you'd be investing in manufacturing alongside clinical, but in order to get the quickest possible vaccine to people, which was the PM's instruction, we did that parallel track.
Was it important before you even began to consider identifying a particular manufacturer, let alone negotiate a contract with them, to know what sort of planning assumption you needed to apply in terms of how many doses we're going to need as a country?
Yes. So we went to the JCVI, the Joint Committee of Vaccination and Immunisation, which is a statutory body which advises Department of Health, and Secretary of State in England is obliged to take their advice. We first met them on the 25th of May, and at that point, their advice to us was you have to vaccinate the vulnerable, and their advice to us was the range of vulnerable people were all adults over the age of 50 and all adults under the age of 50 with severe underlying disease, and it corresponded to basically an enhanced flu cohort and was about 30 million people, 30 odd. So that is
gave you the broad range.
That was the range, because my job is not to decide who should be vaccinated. I need to find out from the experts who they want to vaccinate and then buy vaccines for those people.
With that planning assumption, and bearing in mind the number of people it entailed, you wouldn't have been, the United Kingdom wasn't, the largest country on earth in terms of numbers with whom the manufacturers might care to negotiate. What did you do to make the United Kingdom as attractive a contractual partner as possible?
So we wanted to make ourselves basically the best possible customer, because 30 million people in the UK versus the European Union versus the US, we were tiny. So we took a strategy of basically leveraging the capabilities that we had. So this is a highly collaborative manufacturing, scale-up and manufacturing industry with capabilities, but without a lot of bulk manufacturing capabilities. So that was one task, was how can we turbo boost what's already there. You can't build stuff de novo in a pandemic, but you can increase what's already there. So that was one aspect. The second aspect was to really leverage the fact that we have a phenomenal national health system that is able to run an NIHR able to run clinical trials at a population scale with diversity. So that was the second aspect. And the third aspect was that we would work collaboratively with them and with our regulator, which is the MHRA, so that we could actually get vaccines approved and regulated as soon as possible. And I might just call out June Rain as being a superb vaccine regulator, because she, in her own words, moved the MHRA from being a policeman to an air traffic controller. So instead of waiting until you've got all your data ready and you've got your reports and your submissions with the I's dotted and the T's crossed, she said, bring me the data. As soon as you've got it, we will look at it, we will review it. So at the end point, when you finally give us your last piece of clinical efficacy data or manufacturing quality data, we will be ready to vaccinate. And that, again, was a core offer from the UK. So manufacturing, clinical trials, and regulatory, which is what we then presented to the potential vaccine companies and said, this is the reason you should work with us, because this is what we can offer you.
And so that we're absolutely clear, this entailed the speeding up of the process by which the paperwork, the data and the safety information was given to the MHRA, but there was no diminution in its safety monitoring or the way in which it looked at the data.
No, and if I could just give a statistic, the largest ever vaccine trials that have been run anywhere in the world for the HPV vaccines, and they were 20,000 individuals that were vaccinated. The size of the clinical trials that we're running for COVID vaccines were between 40 and 50,000 people. So these vaccine trials were much, much larger than any vaccine trial had ever been done before. And there was additional requirements put in place, and you can talk to June about this afterwards, is where 99.9% of any adverse events from a vaccine would happen within the first few days of dosing. And so then the regulators put on an additional 30-day time period to say we will not receive any or consider any vaccine submission until we've actually had that additional 30-day time period to be doubly sure that there is, not only have we got the largest trials ever done, but we've also got that additional safety monitoring. So there was no question that safety was taken extremely seriously, and more seriously than any trial has ever been done before.
Can we just come back to the general topic of best possible client and the assistance that was given to the manufacturing process and to the course of identifying and developing vaccines by the involvement in the trial process? Do manufacturers exclusively conduct the trials themselves, or do they extract from trials conducted by the biosciences industry, by government, by the NHS, by the number of these funding bodies, the data that they need for the purposes of verifying their vaccines?
No, each vaccine company has to run their own clinical trials. They cannot rely on third-party data. So they are responsible. They are the sponsor to develop and generate the data to show the vaccines are both safe and effective.
But do they get the participants, or does this entire system rest upon members of the public making themselves available by way of, I don't know, vaccine registries to participate in the trials?
Yes. So that was something else we put in place, was a national vaccine registry on the NHS website. So anybody could sign up and say, I consent to being contacted about clinical trials. So there's a legal requirement to give consent to be contacted. That's different from enrolling in a clinical trial, but at least they can be contacted. So that was part of our using the national NHS infrastructure was so that we could actually provide those patients, not patients, volunteers to take part in those trials.
But much of this structure is funded through bodies such as the UKRI and the NIHR. A lot of the research and development is funded, of course, by these funding bodies. So it's not just a question of the manufacturers taking members of the public and conducting within their exclusive jurisdiction all these trials and the research and development. There's a very strong and notable government input.
For sure. So the government funding for underlying research was critical. So we would not have had Sarah Gilbert's vaccine without the R&D funding. That is correct. We couldn't have run the trials without the NIHR infrastructure and their capability to do that. We provided the volunteers, or in many cases provided the volunteers through the registry. But it's not as if you're taking data from other people. There has to be a single sponsor of the trial that leverages all those capabilities.
Right. And another aspect in which the United Kingdom endeavoured to put itself into the position of being the best possible client was to agree a mutually acceptable position on indemnities. Was that something that the VTF was directly concerned with, or was that a matter for the civil servants in government?
No, it was. So in the US, the US government offers statutory protection to vaccine and therapeutic suppliers in a pandemic, and it's called the US PrEP Act. So every vaccine company we spoke to asked us to put in place statutory protection against liability. We discussed that internally, and that was not a starter, was not something the government would consider. The government would consider, however, negotiating indemnities on a case-by-case basis. Clearly, when I first raised it, there was disbelief that I'd even asked the question, but it was quite clear, because we made it clear, that if we did not offer indemnities, we would not be receiving or procuring any vaccines. And the ultimate approach to securing the government's worry about liabilities is not to give the vaccine if they were concerned about harm, but they would have to sign indemnities if they wanted to actually secure any vaccine at all.
Which they then negotiated on a case-by-case basis. They didn't provide a statutory
Correct.
immunity, which would have meant that no manufacturer would even be liable in court for damages. And the way that the government went about it, is this right, was to agree that manufacturers could still be sued, mainly under the Consumer Protection Act, but in the event that a court awarded damages against them, in certain circumstances, the government would pick up the tab. Do you consider either that untoward pressure was put on the United Kingdom to agree indemnities, or that what was agreed was overly generous to the manufacturers?
I'm not in the detail.
The business case. So, from your witness statement and your book, it is obvious, Dame Kate, that in the course of the VTF's activities, the VTF was required, certainly initially, to battle with the Treasury over the funding for the prospective vaccine purchases. Presumably, you would agree that as with any expenditure of public money, a body intending to spend such vast sums of money has to attempt to quantify what it's likely to spend and try to measure that against the prospective benefit of what it's trying to do.
I agree. And as a venture capitalist, of course, all my companies have to produce budgets against which I then assess them.
But in July 2020, particularly from the emails that we've seen, you were of the view that the departmental structure and the need to battle with the iron fist of the Treasury was slowing you down. You said you raised concern about the speed of approvals across government, and you pushed for a pot of money, that those aren't your words, the words of a civil servant, a pot of money to be delegated so that the process could be sped up. Was that you endeavouring to try to get advance agreement by way of a spending envelope that you could spend up to a cap on the purchase of vaccines without having to seek from the Treasury each time particular approval?
Correct, but I might just comment that
Please.
I wasn't seeking to spend it myself. So the decision on spending came from ministers, but we would recommend it. But you're correct that we didn't want to have to go to the Treasury every time we wanted to make put forward a business case, because I think we had 30 business cases.
Quite. And each time you'd have had to write it all up, and no doubt at great length, and taking time and energy. And that was obviously not a profitable way of proceeding.
Well, we did the business cases for all 30 anyway. And I might just, again, so you know, we had a strategic case, an economic case, a commercial case, a financial case, a management case, all of which was repetitive. No science case, which is fundamentally the most important thing. We had to define what a minimum benefit was. And in our business case, our minimum benefit went between 10 and 200 billion pounds, because it was all so subjective. So my problem was the structure was completely rigid and not fit for purpose, and didn't actually address the important things that we needed to be discussing when it came to vaccines.
You referred there to the
business,
of
the
a
Whitehall
science
business case.
But in the context of having to get permission to spend vast sums of money, there would have to be, of course,
there has to be something.
A business case.
But we submitted a business case to BEIS in June. We did not get an approval from the Treasury till the 11th of September. And
was that the delay to which these emails refer in July, the absence of an answer from HMT?
There was lots of responses, but just endless questions.
Could we look, please, at INQ 000420792, which is the exchange between yourself and Cat Little of the Treasury, from whom we heard a couple of days ago. If we start on page 3, could we just scroll back out? Is that page 3 as opposed to page 4? Yes, it is. Right at the bottom of the page, we can see an email from Cat Little to you. Thanks to you and your colleagues for attending the TAP, that's the Treasury Approval Panel meeting. Extremely useful. We've got a better sense of what you're seeking. We'll issue formal minutes in due course. And then she identifies 3 broad areas we're agreed we need to explore further, and over the page. They're to do with how the bid breaks down, your resource and capability plans, and governance and controls. If we go back to page 3, we can see your response. Dear Cat, I'm very disappointed in this response. We don't seem to have made any progress. We requested a meeting with you at the beginning of July. You then referred to the fact you raised with the Prime Minister the fact that the biggest risk facing the task force was the government itself and its very slow processes, and how shocked he was. We've not received any money even for day-to-day working, nor have we succeeded in speeding out government processes, with a happy exception of the BioNTech Pfizer binding term sheet. And then if we go to page 2, we can see she's disappointed that you're disappointed as to how you feel. There's no decision that slowed you down. Most of our approvals from H&T have been delivered within 24 to 48 hours. But they too are keen to bust through barriers. And then page 1. You say at the bottom, the issue isn't just Treasury, but Cabinet Office commercial controls, and you agree subsequently to meet. By and large, strategically, the problem was resolved because a ministerial panel was set up. I think it started on the 27th of August, 2020, and it was empowered to make decisions over any expenditure over £150 million. So the VTF had delegated authority for sums less than that, but the ministerial panel took the decision for sums over that. Did that panel work, and did it address the problems which you have so pithily identified?
Yes, it was fantastic.
And who was on the panel?
We had 4 ministers. So we had Secretaries of State for Business, Cabinet, Treasury, and then Lord Agnew from the Cabinet Office. So Business, Health, Treasury, and then Lord Agnew from the Cabinet Office.
So it was a combination of departmental spending ministers as well as the Treasury.
Oversight. Brought
together by way of an oversight structure. You must have often reflected as to why that couldn't be put into place across the whole of government.
I think it should be. I mean, it is manifestly a better way to make decisions rather than sequential and keep having to go back. What I did find was there are an awful lot of people who want to be engaged, who are unqualified and yet feel qualified to intervene. And the more you enable that to happen, the slower things are going to be. Whereas if you basically say, no, it's a single business case, it goes to the ministers, and they have to make a decision. They can't prevaricate. They have to make a decision, yes or no. And that worked.
We don't, I think, need to explore the actual negotiations with each of the manufacturers, but it was obviously a protracted and difficult process. But it worked, and of course a number of contracts were agreed. I think probably by way of binding terms, or heads of agreement being agreed, and then the minutiae and the detail of it being negotiated, and then final contracts being reached for advance purchase.
Correct. So Clive would basically shape out the scope of what we were seeking to procure from each vaccine company, and we'd draw up a non-binding heads of terms, which we then announced in July and August, and then Maddie and her team would then turn those heads of terms into formal legal contracts.
And just picking up some of the most notable issues that arose in the course of the negotiations. With AstraZeneca, obviously a UK company which was prepared to sell vaccines at cost and was probably overall the largest single supplier of vaccines globally. Once you'd left the VTF, did you keep an eye on the nature of the relationship between AstraZeneca and government?
Yes, because I'm in the industry. I talk to pharma companies all the time.
And did you gain the impression or the view that despite the success of that contract and the delivery of the AstraZeneca vaccine, the relationship between the UK government and AstraZeneca didn't end in a happy place?
I don't think relationships stop and end, but we had the opportunity the UK had the opportunity to increase production both with AZ in Liverpool as well as GSK in Barnard Castle. Neither of those discussions ended up with any funding, collaboration, partnership. Since then there was a later agreement with AZ, which according to the papers yesterday has now hit buffers again. So it's a very awkward relationship between government and the industry. And there is just deep suspicion. And I was told this time and time again, what are you personally going to get out of this? And people are not doing things, I was working for free. People are not doing this in order for self-gain. They are doing this because they're in an industry where we are trying to develop drugs for patients who have diseases that are poorly treated. And it's not an industry where it's knives out and winner takes all. This is a industry which is a supportive and creative and innovative and highly risky industry. As we talked about, 90% of all drugs that go into clinical trials will fail. So that this is not an easy industry to work in.
And
AstraZeneca had stepped up. They weren't a vaccine company.
And did it make its vaccine available at cost, or
they made their vaccine available at
profit?
cost? And also, not only being a vaccine company, they managed to secure license agreements around the world. So they had something like 15 or 20 different CDMOs manufacturing their license, their vaccine in all the different countries around the world, so that all those people who are vulnerable could have access to vaccines. And they did so very cheaply at cost.
In terms of building up resilience and making sure that in the face of the next pandemic, there is a robust and healthy onshore manufacturing capability, and we'll come back to this later, is it important that these relationships are nurtured and protected?
Yes.
All right. Moderna, is it right that since the pandemic, the UK government has entered into a strategic partnership with Moderna, and I think is investing in the construction or the construction of a manufacturing site, and has a number of agreements with it to provide for sleeping contracts for future production of vaccines.
So I'm not involved, so I don't know the detail of the Moderna contract, but yes, a big Moderna relationship has been set up.
All right. In relation to Pfizer-BioNTech, which is in part a US company, did the VTF encounter significant difficulties on account of the US government planning to invoke the US Defence Production Act to requisition all US domestic supplies of that vaccine?
There was a threat of that, yes, in July, just before we were about to announce the heads of terms with Pfizer-BioNTech. And we were told by the White House that they were going to use the US Defence Act to requisition that. We then agreed with Pfizer and BioNTech that if we agreed to binding language on indemnities, that they would then go back to the White House and say no, that the UK had already signed up and therefore they weren't willing to comply, which is what we did. And within 24 hours, we came back with binding indemnity language, and we then announced the contract, and we then secured, as you know, the vaccines, and we were the first to get it approved, and we were the first to dose.
And I think 40 million doses was the original.
Yeah, which was all we could get.
But to make absolutely plain, notwithstanding the high stakes contractual poker play, the fact is that the indemnities that were agreed in relation to Pfizer-BioNTech were not out of kilter with or any different to the approach on indemnities which had been applied to the
No, it was all, we had to offer indemnities to all the vaccine companies, as did every other country.
Right. Coming now to the topic of antibody cocktails, is this the position that, as you say in your book, Clive Dix, your deputy, led the due diligence relating to the recommendations that were made by the VTF as to what antibody cocktails should be trialled and pursued? And was it the result of the VTF's work on this that the Ronapreve antibody cocktail, which I think is casirivimab and indevimab, was pursued?
Correct. That's the Regeneron cocktail.
The Regeneron cocktail. And
for therapeutic use. So for people who've been infected by SARS-CoV-2, and then it's used to then treat them, to give them an additional immune response.
And what position did the VTF reach in relation to the alternative prophylactic candidate, which was Project Astronaut, Evusheld? When did the VTF first become aware of the potential of that prophylactic candidate?
In May 2020. We knew about it immediately because, again, the BIA, the Bioindustry Association, had been working to basically try and set up standardized assays to assess all potential COVID antibodies, no matter where they came from, academia, industry, small, big companies. And so we were aware of that work, of which AZ was part, right at the beginning. And so we initially signed a heads of terms or letter of intent, but very non-binding, with AZ for 1 million doses of their long-acting antibody cocktail. So this was expected to have a 6-month therapeutic effect right at the beginning.
And it needs to be injected?
No, it's an intramuscular injection. So it's like all the COVID vaccines.
Right.
It's like all childhood.
It is injected.
It's injected, not intravenous.
Right.
Sorry, that's my fault. Most antibodies would be delivered intravenously, as in through a catheter into the blood. This was unusual because it was both engineered to have a 6-month half-life, as well as to be delivered through intramuscularly.
And was the provisional agreement to the effect that 1 million doses would be purchased, because that would provide 1 dose of 2 antibodies for what was assessed to be the 500,000 or so immunocompromised people?
Yes. So again, the numbers of immunocompromised people were data that had come from Department of Health, and that was their estimate. So our thoughts were you either dose those immunocompromised people and you cover them for 12 months, so 2 6-month doses, or, as we thought at the time, that the SARS-CoV-2 might be a winter virus, in which case you would cover them for 2 winters. We didn't know at that time, but we thought that 2 doses was at least enough to secure an order until we knew more about how the virus was going to work.
Now, on the 26th of October, your Director General, Nick Elliott, wrote to the CMO, Professors Chris Whitty and Clara Swinson of the DHSE and others, seeking confirmation on the exact number of immunocompromised patients on whom Evusheld or to whom Evusheld might be deployed.
Yes, and the reason for that was AZ had come back to us after we'd said we wanted 1 million doses to cover our immunocompromised population. They then came back and said the most they could manufacture or have manufactured was 2.5 million doses for the world, and therefore the UK couldn't have 1 million, and we needed to be scaled back. And so that letter from Nick was to say, well, we can't get 1 million because that's not reasonable. What is the minimum amount that we would want for the UK, which would be consistent with AZ making their antibody available more broadly globally?
Now, after this was then debated within the office of the Chief Medical Officer, on the 11th of December, Sir Chris Whitty wrote back to Nick Elliott, saying in essence that he couldn't recommend buying a large amount now because of the changed landscape. But he said that if there was a political appetite to buy, he would suggest around 50,000 doses only. And then in February, as it happens, there was further advice sought from the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, and Professor Sir Jonathan Van Dam emailed saying the steer from the CMO remains 50,000 doses, and ultimately, the decision was made that there wouldn't be an advance purchase of the prophylactic Evusheld. By the time you left in December 20, were you aware of the way in which the wind was blowing in terms of whether the government would pursue Evusheld?
Yes, I was. And I felt very strongly that we were conducting a strategy that was not following the Prime Minister's goals. So we were following, or we, the government, was following a very clear 2-tier strategy where the clinically vulnerable, immunocompromised patients were being deprioritised in favour of those who were able to receive vaccines. And I felt that was manifestly wrong, both ethically and morally, but also did not follow the goals that we'd been set, which was to protect the entire population. And you've kindly shared witness statements that I've read, and I'm afraid to say the witness statements clearly show that there was zero appetite in Department of Health to actually consider how these patients would be treated. So the evidence is that it was cheaper to let these clinically vulnerable individuals who were already shielding to stay shielding at home, and then if they were to be infected, then they would be treated with drugs. But that there was no appetite because of cost to actually buy the therapeutics now. Now, again, that is at odds with the way we did our commercial contracts with vaccines. So in the case of vaccines, we of course didn't know which of any of these vaccines would work. So we provided some money up front to help with the manufacturing scale up and with the clinical development. Then if the vaccine actually showed it was effective, then that was another milestone, and we made another milestone payment. Then when, whatever doses had been agreed was delivered, we made another milestone payment. So you don't have to pay all the money up front. There was a comment in one of these statements about shelf life, and they couldn't accommodate the shelf life. Well, that is wrong, because because, of course, when you are developing a new drug, you don't have the data to show an 18-month shelf life because you haven't been developing it long enough to have that stability data. So there was a catalogue of reasons which I don't think, I'm afraid, any are sound in reasons for why the clinically vulnerable immunocompromised patients in the UK were deprioritised versus those who could receive vaccine.
I think it's important that I put to you that the letter from Professor Sir Chris Whitty of the 11th of December, which I know you've been provided with a copy of, didn't make any reference to cost. And I think Sir Chris Whitty would say, if we were to ask him this question directly, that was within the reach of the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. Cost wasn't for him. And he makes no reference to cost. What he says is there's a different context now because of the vaccine rollout. By December 2020, there is the prospect of the vaccine programme succeeding, and therefore the context had changed, and it remained difficult to assess against that context what the ultimate benefit of Evusheld would be. So it wasn't, from the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, a cost issue. They were relying upon other epidemiological and clinical issues.
Well, I'm reading one of the statements that says, I consider cost, including cost effectiveness and practicality considerations, to be entirely rational factors when making decisions on neutralising antibody procurement.
And whose statement is that?
JVT's.
That's JVT's, right. But
so cost clearly played a role, right. No question on that. And the fact that the vaccine rollout had been effective doesn't stop people without an immune system getting infected. And the idea that you take your most clinically vulnerable and say, well, don't worry, you're going in for a bone marrow transplant to treat your leukemia, but, you know, coming into hospital, if you get infected with COVID, don't worry, we'll treat you. Rather than saying, you know what, you're in a very clinically vulnerable time of your life, let's give you all the help we can before you go in for this traumatic procedure.
The issue of whether or not to pursue monoclonal antibodies was, as you've said, a matter of the VTF. It was within your reach. Ultimately, the decision on not to pursue an advance purchase was therefore one that would have been subject of a recommendation from the VTF. You rightly pointed out earlier that ultimately decisions are for ministers. Before you left in December 2020, were you aware of what the VTF itself would recommend?
Yes, and the VTF was strongly supportive
of purchasing Evusheld in advance?
As a tool to manage those individuals that otherwise we were not managing.
Did you happen to see, or was it brought to your attention, that Professor Sir Chris Whitty had written expressing the views of the Office of the Chief Medical Officer?
I hadn't seen the letter, but I understood, and I spoke to Chris, and I understood the arguments. Well, I heard the arguments. I didn't agree with them.
And no doubt, in your inimitable way, you would have pushed back against those arguments.
So my job was not to tell the Chief Medical Officer how to manage public health in the UK. My job was to make vaccines and prophylactic treatments available for use and for deployment. If they choose not to deploy, that is not for me to influence. I just think it was the wrong decision, and I think it is symptomatic of business as usual in Whitehall, as opposed to what the vaccine taskforce was, which was to deliver some very clear goals.
My lady, is that a convenient moment? There's only one topic to go.
Yep. We take regular breaks for everyone's sake, but also the stenographer's sake. So should we return in at 11:30? Thank you.
Thank you.
All rise. Mr. Keith.
Dame Kate, in part deference to the assistance you've given the tribunal, we're now going to plug your book, The Long Shot, and have a look at it. It's INQ 000474735. You take the opportunity in your book, and this is page 21, to make recommendations for improvements in the future. And this section of your book focuses on the recommendations you make in respect of government, about which you've said a few things already. And I want to please spend a little time, not too much, on these 5 recommendations, on account of your almost unique position as the chair of the Vaccine Task Force and engaging, of course, very, very closely with government. And I think it's probably important that I emphasise through you that, of course, a great deal of what government does is extremely good and very effective. However, the first recommendation that you make is this: reward outcome, not process. And you talk about the need to ensure that Whitehall is refocused on outcomes, not procedures, that outperformers need to be promoted and underperformers released, stop rapid rotation of staff, promote specialist science skills, mandate training for ministers, seek robust references on past performance, and recalibrate, in essence, the thinking of government officials.
I completely agree that those are critical for Whitehall. So I faced working with, not my steering group was excellent and they were handpicked and they did a great job, but I spent so much time basically batting incoming questions, inquiries, having to educate officials. It was obstructive in many cases. And I might say that the National Audit Office doing a 5-month audit during my 6-month tenure is completely ridiculous. But it is...
We can't go there for reasons of parliamentary privilege. I know, but it's all the mentality. It's in my book and it's in my witness statement, and everybody should read the letter. But it reinforces this whole box-checking view of the world, which is we can't be criticised if we follow all these boxes. So I'll give you an example. Patrick Vallance had to stop Whitehall from investing in a chicken egg manufacturing plant because that is the way that vaccines always used to be made, with lots and lots of people injecting chicken eggs, and that's how you get vaccines. And he had to say, well, have you actually heard about recombinant techniques, which is the modern day of making vaccines? And so what happens is you've basically got this groupthink, and we've saw it with mRNA, and alas, we've got a vaccine. We now can basically ignore everything else we've done. We ignore the fact that we need a breadth of vaccine formats. And in fact, even the JCVI now has had to formally put it in their recommendations that they want to have a protein-based vaccine because government at the moment is going down a very narrow, we've got mRNA and this is all we ever need forever. And that is not true. And this is the problem, is you've just got people that don't understand what it is we're doing. They have hostile relationships with industry. They distrust them. And again, read my witness statement and the book to see how they've behaved with Valneva and Novavax. I don't want to go into the detail of any individual manufacturer.
I'm not going to go into the detail. I'm just encouraging everybody, if they want to see a good story, look at the SEC filings, because that will tell you how our government has behaved.
Dame Kate, I'm afraid you're in danger of doing what some of your predecessors have done of a more political hue. You have to answer the questions, please, not go off in other directions. Much of what you say under this heading of reward outcome, not process, appears to focus on performance, because you refer to ridding the system of underperformers and promoting outperformers and stop rapid rotation and reward the skillful. Do you think there is a general problem in terms of there not being any absence of good faith, but because many of the politicians and officials you dealt with were generalists rather than specialists, in particular STEM graduates or STEM trained?
You are quite right. So this was an observation I made immediately having joined Bayes. And actually, I spoke to the head of recruiting or HR at Bayes pretty quickly and said, this is the business department and industrial strategy. You have nobody with any business skills and you've got nobody with any understanding of the industry in which we're operating. And how does that work? And they've all got humanities degrees with an economics master's, and none of them have any relevant expertise. So, and if you look at the stats, 90% of Whitehall have humanities backgrounds, so only 10% are STEM. And if you have a PhD in the civil service, you hide it under a bushel, because as soon as you're discovered to be a scientist, then you're a wonk and you're put in the corner and you're never allowed to do anything. And more importantly, no one's ever done anything. So they're all busy writing policy papers and sending each other, stuff to review and all that. None of that actually gets to the heart of what it is they're trying to do. What are they trying to achieve, and are they measured against the delivery of their goals? And the answer is no. In the private sector, you don't deliver your goals, you're out of a job and you have to move on. And in the private sector, you get referenced, and if you don't perform, people know about that. That is not the way it works in the civil service.
Do more and write less?
Do what Whitehall calls delivery. So get out into the front line, spend some time in industry, do something that is not what they regard as the most important part, which is policy writing, and do something that is achieving something that is for the common good. And it's not that they're not good-natured, and it's not that they're not hardworking and well-meaning, because I think they are all of those things. They're just ill-equipped for the 21st century, technologically driven society in which we operate.
And is that why, in essence, if we look at page 23, you refer to the need to embed scientific thinking in science and policy making, just like economics, and you refer to the need for scientific thinking to be at the forefront of what, in particular, Bayes does, and then
not just Bayes, across government.
Across government, and then at the bottom of the page, you go as far as suggesting a complete overhaul of the recruitment, professional development, and incentives for civil servants. By that, if we go over the page, did you have in mind, or do you express views on turnover, having a slower turnover and less rotation? You say something quite pithy, I think, about firing people dealing with communications
all of
engagement. Well, I don't think we can go probably that far, Dame Kate, but you express some pretty trenchant views on the need to ensure that government officials have a better trained, a better analytical, a better statistical and science-based approach to what they do.
And what it is that you're trying to achieve. So when I'm getting emails from Bayes Communications saying, we've approved you to do a speech to Gavi, which had already been pre-recorded and delivered 2 days earlier, you kind of think, what world are you on? Because this has already been done. They're just not thinking. They're not engaged in what are you trying to achieve? So,
and,
yes.
Yes, sorry, please go on. Page 24, and perhaps at a more granular level, you suggest, and this is in fact something which is one of my ladies' recommendations in the Module 1 report. So I think we might have beaten you to it from today's vantage point. Appoint a senior and permanent pandemic security capability, and then on page 25, agree a strong international approach to vaccine research and development, which we've already discussed.
Could I just make a point on that, please? The whole idea of manufacturing and capability in the UK, the government's view, it's all about, have we made investments and are we doing the right thing? And then missing the point that factories are basically people who know what they're doing. They are doing it. They're doing it repeatedly at scale. It's not about the building. It's about the people and what it is that they are doing and delivering. And we cannot be in a position where we can say, well, look, we've got all these shiny new buildings, but without somebody with a plan and somebody saying, this is what we want you to do and this is how we're going to assess you and measure you. And there is no capability in government doing that. And again, I heard the witnesses from UK HSA. It is business as usual, procurement, government bureaucracy. It is not strategic planning to make sure that we are better set up for the future.
On that topic, there was in December 2020 a recommendations document produced by the VTF, authored by yourself and Clive Dix. I presume, or we presume, that it's dated December 2020 because it was approaching the end of your time with the VTF. You recommend the creation of a new executive agency within BEIS as a central body responsible for coordination of industrial and public sector assets and maintaining the relationship between the UK's vaccine industrial base and government. Did you have in mind an agency or a body, it doesn't have to be a statutory body, of course, that would deal with vaccine-related issues on an end-to-end basis, so dealing with clinical development as well as the research and development and going through to the scale-up and the manufacturing end of the process?
Correct.
So not just procurement, but a wider remit.
Absolutely, that is what we were recommending. It wasn't published at the time because it was deemed that if they published it, it would be government policy. When it wasn't, it was recommendations from the Vaccine Task Force. But what we were trying to recommend was how can you ensure that this capability and this drive and this partnership relationship continues with industry and with the innovators? Because our vaccines have been very effective at controlling serious disease and death, but they don't block transmission. They're not durable. They're expensive. You've got cold chains. They're endless. They are specific. They're not broad. So there's lots of things that we need to do to improve, and there is no coherence in how we're actually going to deliver those improved processes. And yes, you need to have somebody with an external viewpoint, not a bureaucratic mindset to say, what does the contract say? And now let's enforce you. This is not a, buying generics. It is being innovative and creative and collaborative.
And
Forgive my interrupting, Keith. Supposing you had a government that was reluctant to set up another body, like an independent vaccine agency, what arguments would you put forward to persuade the government that it was absolutely central?
If you were able to recruit the right people into UK HSA, it's possible that might work, but then you lose all the commercial capability. So the problem is that you've got this conflict between the commercial side and the clinical side, and we've seen it in the testimony. The clinical side is all about how do we not generate precedent, we don't want to spend money, and what's the path of least resistance is the sort of yes minister view, and the commercial side wants to get on with it. So the reason to have a separate agency is they would have the authority, like we did at the VTF, to actually make recommendations that deliver an outcome. If you put it into an existing government department, you're going to end up with the same business as usual, and you're going to be bogged down in bureaucracy. And actually, in one of these, your session yesterday with Chris Whitty, where you talked about how many different bodies were assessing Evershed.
Prophylaxis.
Yeah, something like 6 or 8 different bodies, all of which had to give their views on things. Now, if you're embedded in government, you're going to get lots of that. The real success that we had was we were slightly outside government. So even though we reported into BEIS, we were not part of government. And that was what caused friction. People didn't like it.
But that's the word, is slightly, isn't it? Because you were a body within BEIS. However, you had a very strong external input, and you had the independence and the authority to be able to report directly to the Prime Minister, which you negotiated successfully in advance. So you were a government body with bells on, external bells. That was the key.
I think that is critical. And again, if you continue with the defence analogy, defence isn't being split between different departments with lots of people putting their oars in. They have a very clear goal: protect the UK, support your allies, all of those things. It's very similar. We're much more likely to have another pandemic than we are to be invaded. We've had 7 pandemics since 2020.
I think you must have read my lady's foreword to the Module 1 report, where precisely that point is made in the second paragraph.
Excellent. I'm delighted. Thank you.
So, do we take it? I want to ask you just 1 or 2 questions about a second recommendation that you make. You have spoken in the past about the need for a vaccine registry. Without going into the detail of it, the vaccine registry was the process by which I think around about, in total, 500,000 people volunteered by mid-21 to participate in vaccine trials. And of course, the process itself was also used to generate data for other public health policy decisions. Would you like to see that vaccine registry put on a permanent and perhaps surer footing?
Thank you for raising this. This is one of the good news responses. So the registry, you're correct, we have 542,000 people that are signed up on the NHS registry. In middle of 22, I'm obviously one of them, middle of 22 I received an email saying we are shutting down the registry and if you want to re-register into our new registry, please go ahead. So of course I was not very thrilled with that email and said so and shook the trees quite hard. And the outcome was that this registry has not been shut down and has in fact been enlarged and embedded within NIHR's larger registry. It now has over 42% over the age of 60. So exactly the sorts of people who will need to be tested for every kind of drug. It's not just for vaccines, it's for any therapeutic. And it's been linked with a database where you can search for clinical trials. So this is starting to deliver the strategy that we set out, which was we'll do something very specific for vaccines because we need to, and we've got to get bodies into the trials quickly, but we need to leave something with a legacy so that we are broader, not just for pandemic preparedness, but for the UK. So this is definitely a plus that I'm very pleased about. One of your witness statements suggested that was a legacy of something else. That is not the case. This is a completely de novo vaccine registry that we stood up in July 2020.
And did you and Clive Dix in particular also secure approval for another type of capability, but broadly on the same lines, namely the Human Challenge Programme, which is a trial in which healthy young adults receive a vaccine before then being given the virus to test the efficacy of the vaccine? Yes,
we did. And so I asked my friend and colleague, Garth Rappaport, who used to run respiratory at GSK, and I've backed him twice as CEO, and I've backed him to do human challenge studies in his respiratory companies successfully. And I called him and said, you know, what do I do? Because again, I'm not a vaccine expert. I work with lots of brilliant people. I'm a mouthpiece compared with all these fantastic people. And Garth then said, what you need to do is human challenge, because you will be able to understand how the virus is infecting, and therefore you can start thinking about development of vaccine therapeutics and diagnostics. And actually, those papers that have been published both in the New England Journal and in the Lancet has shown that exactly. And it did alter the course of government policy. So it showed that lateral flow tests were able to pick up live virus before PCR. And in fact, when PCR was still registering positive, lateral flow showed that you could, it didn't register dead virus, basically. So it was a more effective test. So there are some clearly useful things that came out of it. But it's a difficult test because as viruses mutate, you have to then mutate, you have to remanufacture. So I think it was a useful experience, but it hasn't continued. And
drawing some of the threads from what you said earlier about the manufacturing base for vaccines and also therapeutics together in very short terms, do you call as loudly as you are capable for the manufacturing of vaccines and antibodies to be nurtured and secured as far as is possible, and for the manufacturing and industrial base, the sites, the factories, to be maintained or reconstructed or certainly grown?
I mean, that's a very large question. We need to have a strategy and the plan of how we're going to secure, grow and expand our manufacturing base has to be led by somebody who comes from the manufacturing industry. We were blessed to have Ian McCubbin in our team, and Everybody knows Ian and everybody loves him. So when Ian would call up and say, I need you to do me a favour, I need you to help, everybody would. If somebody from UKHSA calls up these vaccine companies, these manufacturers and say, I need you to help, they won't, because they don't have that warmth, collaborative relationship. So what we need, it's not just about buildings, it's about a plan and a coordinated plan to bring together the public sector, the private sector, government, all of which we've got all the bits in place and we've shown we could do it in 2020, but that is not being nurtured and it is not being coordinated effectively, and we don't have the people to do it. And that is what's missing, and that is what needs to get put in place.
Because it always fundamentally comes back to people, doesn't it?
Completely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keith. I think some questions from Mr. Thomas, who's over there, Dame Kate.
Excellent.
Good morning, Dame Kate. Can you hear me?
Yep, just.
Okay. So just bear with me one moment. My name's Leslie Thomas and I'm representing FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. I've only got a small handful of questions for you. You state and note at paragraph 4110 of your statement that the VTF had planned a paid advertisement campaign to support a large-scale push to drive people to sign up to the NHS registry, and that the costs for this had been approved by the VTF business case. And you go on to say, and let me just quote, "We were particularly keen that our targeted campaign should reach those most at risk from infection, including the elderly, those with severe underlying diseases, and frontline workers. We also especially wanted to attract people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds who were disproportionately affected by COVID, and who the evidence suggested might be among the more vaccine hesitant to sign up." End of quote. You also note at paragraph 4112 that the Cabinet Office then suddenly blocked expenditure from our budget for advertising the NHS registry, even though these costs had already been approved. And you go on to say, "I still do not know how or why this happened. This ban further complicated our work, as it meant that the VTF had to try to deliver a national message without the benefit of any targeted advertising support." Question: have you since become aware why the Cabinet Office made this decision to block expenditure?
No, I think it just goes back to my box checking process point, which is in order to recruit advertisers or companies, they had to go through a formal government procurement process, which was too slow, and we wouldn't, by the time that had happened, the vaccine had been, the registry had been and gone. So it was astonishingly irritating, and it significantly hindered our ability to deliver that vaccine registry.
Right. Let me ask you the next question, which is this. What impact, if any, do you think this had on ethnic minority recruitment to the NHS registry?
I mean, I think the impact was that we had fewer minority ethnic individuals that signed up. We ended up with about 8% in the registry, and there's a public-facing dashboard, so you can actually go in and have a look at it. But we did work with NIHR and we worked with the Behavioural Insights Unit. We tried lots of different things to try and figure out how to address vaccine hesitancy. And Mr. Francis, if I can just touch on it, I've spent over 30 years working in drug discovery and development. That is I live, eat, sleep, thinking about it. I had never been part of a clinical trial. And if I hadn't been part of a clinical trial, how are we going to get members of the general public to do it? So the first thing I did, obviously, was to sign up into a clinical trial. But I was very clear that unless you tell people why it's important, what it involves, what the risks are, and what the opportunities are of being involved, people aren't going to sign up. So it was really important to get that information out in order to get people to sign up.
Hence the advertising strategy.
Everything. So because that was blocked, we ended up having to go, we went on to local radio. Divya, who was a wonderful person leading clinical trials, went on to Asian radio. We worked with a fantastic physician in Bradford, Dinesh Sularaya, who basically was a sort of community champion who addressed more of the Muslim community. But it wasn't helped because trying to do things piecemeal, you know, I'd have interviews with, you know, breakfast TV doctors to try and say why we should do that.
Right.
But it definitely harmed us.
Let me move on to my last question. I want to be forward-thinking and looking. What recommendations would you make to increase the participation of ethnic minority groups in vaccine clinical trials in the future?
I mean, we can start now. We have a registry on the NHS website, which anybody can sign up to. Once they're signed up, they can go in and search clinical trials that they may be eligible for. If you think about it, most diseases are not cured. So anybody with a diagnosis of a disease that isn't well managed would be well advised to go and look to see whether or not there's a clinical trial they can take part in. And so what I would do is absolutely promote the opportunity for people to have a better potential healthcare outcome by taking part in clinical trials to then see, are there new drugs that would actually suit and treat that particular condition that people might have? And then you'll need to get community champions, you'll need to get local trusted individuals, whether they're physicians, teachers, religious leaders, to encourage people to do it. Because this is a highly, highly regulated industry. Safety is paramount in and it's by law that we have to do a lot of work before you even start to put drugs into people, and you need to tell people that it's available and what the opportunities are and what the risks are.
Yeah, trust is important, isn't it?
Trust is critical, and so by trying to hide information or not give people access to full and fair information is just doesn't address the trust issue.
Yeah, bureaucratic blockages don't help, do they?
They certainly don't. You can imagine how thrilled I was when I got that response.
Milady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. I think that completes the questions for you.
Excellent.
Dame Kate. I don't know, you said you've obviously been following some of the evidence. Your appointment as chair of the Vaccine Task Force was described yesterday as a stroke of genius, and I think we can see why. Thank you so much for everything you and your colleagues did. It was an extraordinary achievement.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
My lady, the next witness is Dr. Mary Ramsey.
Thank you. Would you like to take the oath?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please sit down. Please, can you say your full name?
Yeah, Mary Ramsey.
Thank you for attending today to assist the inquiry, Dr. Ramsey. A few preliminary matters. Could I ask you to keep your voice nice and loud and speak slowly, please? You have produced a witness statement that's INQ 000496177, dated the 26th of July 2024. It runs to 70 pages and 102 exhibits. Have you had the opportunity to familiarise yourself with that statement recently?
I have, thank you.
And are you satisfied that its contents are true to the best of your knowledge?
I am, thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to touch first on your professional background. You're currently Director of Public Health Programmes at UK HSA, and prior to that you were Head of Immunisation and Deputy Director of the Immunisations and Vaccine Preventable Diseases Division within the National Infection Service in PHE, as it then was, from March 2018 until the establishment of UK HSA in October 2021. Is that all correct?
That's correct.
And before that, you held roles as Head of Immunisation, Hepatitis and Blood Safety within PHE, and indeed in its predecessor organisation, the Health Protection Agency, from as far back as 2009. You have extensive clinical expertise, which I won't attempt to summarise in full here, but is it right that you hold a medical degree, you have extensive research experience in epidemiology of vaccine preventable and bloodborne diseases, 30 years of that kind of expertise and research?
That's correct.
You have acted as an advisor to the World Health Organization, including as a member of the Covid-19 vaccination subgroup. And finally, and importantly for the evidence you'll give today, you are also the editor of the Immunisation Against Disease, known as the Green Book.
That's right.
And have been since 2006.
That's correct.
Thank you. Just remind ourselves of that which may be well familiar, the transition of PHE to UK HSA. That was UK HSA was established on the 1st of April 2021, but became operational on the 1st of October 2021. But of course, when we are referring to matters pre that date, we're talking about PHE.
That's correct.
The role of PHE, its key responsibilities in terms of infectious diseases, was one of a duty to protect the public from infectious diseases, and also, was it not, to evaluate the effectiveness of immunisation programmes and procure and supply of vaccines, and improve population health by supporting health and care services. Is that a fair summary of the duties?
Some of the duties, I should say.
Some of. It's worth reiterating, however, that Public Health England wasn't mandated or indeed funded to be ready to respond to a pandemic of the scale that was encountered with Covid-19. Is that right?
I think that's fair.
Moving then to touch on the work undertaken by Public Health England, as it was then, on vaccinations when moving towards the rollout of Covid-19 vaccines. Were there two divisions within PHE, the Immunisation and Vaccine Preventable Diseases Division, the IVPD, which is probably the one that you may refer to most in your evidence today.
Yes.
And there was another division, the Vaccines and Countermeasures Response Division. Was there also a board, a vaccination, a Covid-19 vaccination programme board set up in May 2020?
Yes, so we ran boards, the IVPD ran boards with VCR for the introduction of all new vaccines or any changes to the vaccine programme. So in May 20, we decided to set up one in anticipation that there would be a COVID vaccine at some point to support some of the work streams that we would need to deliver in preparation for that.
And when preparation started for the commencement of the deployment of vaccines, is it right that that board was dissolved in September 2020, but effectively because NHSE were going to take on the vaccine deployment programme through their vaccine deployment delivery group?
Yes, I think they took over a lot of our sort of project management stuff, but obviously there was a much greater need to scale up the actual delivery, so it became DHSE decided it made more sense for them to lead that because there was so much additional delivery capacity needed.
So in England, the decision was made that the NHSE would take the lead on deployment of vaccinations as opposed to PHE. In the context of this pandemic, was PHE of the view at the time that that was appropriate, that division of responsibility?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that that we were a relatively small team within PHE, a much smaller organisation, so it made sense for NHS to take on some of the huge scale. But obviously we wanted to be, and we were, embedded within that work and leading on the areas that we had the expertise on.
Well, perhaps just before we get into the detail of the matters covered in your statement, by way of overview of what the responsibilities were as opposed to what they were not, PHE took responsibility, importantly, for storage and distribution, taking on the enormous task of building the national infrastructure to enable the storage and distribution of vaccines across the UK, importantly, whilst maintaining the required temperature regimes. Is that correct?
Yes, although because, again, it was a very different product from previous products, there was an element which, whereas we deliver for normal vaccines, we delivered to the end user, the doctor and nurse who are giving the vaccines. In this, we delivered to a sort of series of hubs, and then the NHS commissioned onward delivery at that point. So it was a joint piece of work, but we did substantial amounts of work in getting the infrastructure in terms of freezers, etc., set up to receive the vaccines.
And the IVPD, the division mainly dealing with this work, did it in overview, have the following functions: that it provided scientific advice and secretariat support to the JCVI.
That's correct.
It provided clinical and technical input for NHS England to support the design of that deployment that we've just been discussing. Of course, the Green Book was also a responsibility that we've mentioned. And then responsibility too for the clinical documentation, the supporting guidance, the toolkits, as we sometimes hear them referred to, training materials, Q&A materials that would be used or would be the basis of NHS health professionals' documentation for the immunisation programme.
That's correct.
So focusing in then on the first main topic that I'd like to ask you about, which is vaccine safety and PHE and then UKHSA's involvement on vaccine safety issues. Could you first help us to get an idea of where PHE sat alongside the other bodies involved in safety? So first, MHRA, what work did the relevant division do in assisting MHRA in its safety investigations and surveillance?
Well, the MHRA has primary responsibility for safety of all therapeutics and vaccines, but we've had a long-standing relationship with them, in particular in relation to, first of all, because we're the group that monitors how effective the vaccine is, that's part of that risk-benefit, how much benefit you're getting versus any safety concerns. And we've been working with them for many years on developing their methods. We have, the PHE had privileged access, I guess, to a lot of clinical data systems that allowed us to do some of the investigations of potential safety concerns. And over many years, we had done that for MMR and other vaccines in the past. And we work, as I said, we worked very closely. And actually, during the pandemic, we embedded people. We had joint staff embedded with MHRA to try and support them in their role. I think the other thing we have is we have a much stronger sort of clinical network intelligence role with. We tend to get things reported from clinical networks through our clinical colleagues that we work with, because we work with frontline health protection, our frontline teams in health protection, work with local providers. So we get a lot of soft intelligence that we feed in jointly with the MHRA.
And in terms of NHSE, was it the role of PHE UKHSA when it came to safety to inform the clinical advice and information about safety that NHSE would be using?
Well, again, we worked jointly on that, but we were the sort of work stream lead for surveillance, which included safety, and so we were the people representing, I guess, some of MHRA interests with the NHS. So we worked very closely with them on the development of those protocols.
If we could move on now then to that surveillance strategy and the specifics on it, you explain in your statement that there were 4 main components to the surveillance strategy, which PHE, MHRA and NHSE collaborated on, as you describe it, to monitor the implementation of the programme and the safety of it once vaccines had begun to be deployed. The first of those 4 elements you describe as enhanced passive surveillance. Could you translate that, please? What does that mean?
Well, most people are familiar with the concept of the yellow card system, which is the reporting system that basically is a passive system, which means that people have to report it. There's no active. We don't go and ask people. It's what comes in through this passive system. So those are the sort of that's the backbone of most safety surveillance. I'm sure the MHRA can explain this better, and there are some expert reports that explain this. So that's the sort of backbone. But it also includes other sources of intelligence, exactly those things I was talking about earlier. Clinical networks may approach us and say, we're seeing something unusual. So that sort of passive reporting, which is where people out in the health service report to us without us seeking advice.
You talk about active surveillance in specific cohorts. What does that
That's something that the MHRA established, which is where they set up a system where a group of people were recruited to report any symptoms they got after vaccination. So that's an active reporting system, because they are asked, how are you after your vaccine, in an active way. So they were recruited to this enhanced surveillance.
Also, formal epidemiological investigations. It really, in summary form, what does that mean?
Yes, so where you have a potential signal, like, say, vaccine X is associated with condition Y, then what we would normally do, and that's where PHE has a really big role, is do a formal investigation where we may collect data specially, or we may use an existing data set and formally look at whether there is an increased risk of that condition in a certain time period following vaccination, for example. So it's an analytical study to test a hypothesis.
And the 4th branch, the near real-time monitoring for a set of events of interest. What does that mean? So
in advance of a vaccine being approved, you may have, from the basis of the trials or from previous experience, a series of conditions that you think may well be potential side effects of the vaccine. And so what you put in place in advance is some process of actively collecting information on those conditions, a list of conditions, in real time as the vaccine programme is rolled out, and constantly looking at that to see whether you're getting more than you might expect based on the background rate.
Could we have on screen, please, document INQ 000477132? This is the Covid19 vaccine surveillance strategy dated January 2020. If we could go to, please, page 7.
21, I think it probably was it? January 21, that's all, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I apologise. Thank you. If we could go, please, to page 7, at paragraph 4.1, there we see the heading signal detection. So this is the policy of the strategy of PHE setting out how signal detection would work. A signal of potential adverse events may come from a range of sources, such as pre-licensure clinical trials, MHRA assessments of yellow card reports, active follow-up, and also from other countries or specialist healthcare professionals seeing increases in consultations for specific conditions. So does this capture what you were referring to earlier about the network of reporting back to PHE being relied upon, not just the yellow card system and waiting for people to report, but this web of routes of feedback?
Exactly, yes.
And then if we just for completeness look at 4.2, please, on the same page. Rapid assessment to assess any signal coming from these sources. A more detailed investigation is needed before a full epidemiological study is performed. So what does that relate to, please?
So that relates to these conditions. So, for example, if the trial had suggested there was a case of condition X, and that was in our predefined list of conditions, then we would actively look at data sets that collect information on how many cases of disease X are occurring, and be comparing that to how many people being vaccinated to work out whether or not there was any signal of a higher rate in people who are vaccinated.
Thank you. We can take that document down now. Was there also in place a standard operating procedure when it came to surveillance and safety issues that had been agreed with NHS England?
Yes, it was a surveillance and response, actually. It was in order to manage... so one of the difficulties with the programme, we were starting to roll it out in older people, many of whom were frail, had underlying medical conditions. And so it was not surprising that we would expect to see people being taken ill after vaccination, and we wanted to be sure that that was being captured properly and also assessed at the time to make sure, one, that they were being managed appropriately and reported to the MHRA, and also that my colleagues who work at local level as well as ourselves can provide advice on the implications of that for the programme, particularly where there was potential concerns about, denting confidence in the programme, where people hear about a condition that occurs after vaccination.
So this was an operating procedure for any clinical incident that arose in the delivery of vaccines, which might include things like storage being an issue, administration errors, right up to incidents that may cause worry and may need further investigation. Yeah. Could we have a look, please, at INQ 000 421370, which we see there is the standard operating procedure, and this particular version dated the 9th of December 2020. Could we go to page 9, please, of that document? This is something that's described as the clinical case escalation framework. Certainly, I do not intend to ask you questions explaining every element of this diagram, but perhaps just to get an overview of those systems of reporting that you described earlier. We see on the left-hand side there that if an incident is identified, that on the left-hand side, a route is to report to the MHRA by the yellow card system. But there is also another route, and just pausing there before we get to it, this document is intended for clinicians delivering vaccines in mass vaccination centres, GPs delivering, the range of routes of delivery. It's intended for them to read if there is a clinical incident at the point of the vaccine being given. Is that correct?
Yes, and also for the wider NHS. I said at the time the programme in the NHS was being managed as part of the emergency response procedures, because that was what's set up for the whole pandemic. So the NHS, as you realise, was under immense pressure, and so was managing things as an emergency. So they had this regional and national escalation system. And
just looking at this diagram, is that what we see here?
In the middle.
There are regional points of contact which then feed into the National Incident Coordination Centre.
Exactly.
And that eventually that can be escalated right up to DHSC once it has gone through the route of escalation, if it is a matter of concern in terms of potential side effects of vaccines.
Exactly, and I think this was bringing together that incident structure with the technical support from MHRA and from PHE at the time.
Thank you. We can take that down. So again, I don't want to labour the point, but this is in addition to MHRA's own yellow card surveillance system, although obviously you're working closely together.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is it also right that within that standard operating procedure, there was available a 7-day-a-week, I think 12 hours a day, phone line, which clinicians could contact with any concerns.
So, I mean, MHRA already have, I think, a phone line. I think what we put in place as well was an expert vaccine kind of capacity through my own team, really. So that was, as you say, 7 days a week. Mainly, actually, probably email, but it was available on phone using our duty doctor system.
I want to move on now from those systems of surveillance to ask you about what information was provided to people receiving the vaccine or considering receiving the vaccine about safety. Please, could you explain what input PHE and then UKHSA had into the information about safety which people received?
Okay, well, I mean, I think, again, a bit like the safety monitoring, that it's not just one thing, but our responsibility, my own team's responsibility at PHE is on providing the sort of information resources that are used by healthcare professionals to help with consent of individuals for vaccination. And that's our kind of normal role outside of the pandemic as well. So when a new vaccine is introduced, we will develop a patient-facing resource leaflet, which explains why people need the vaccine, what the side effects are, a broad range of things. And we did that as well in the pandemic, and in the programme, I should say. And we produce that in a range of formats, a range of languages. We print it so that it's available for people to actually read as a piece of paper as well as online. And we produce other kind of formats for people, for BSL, Braille, other ways, videos for people who don't have high literacy, easy read, and all those sorts of different approaches.
So that information about what the vaccine is and what the risks and benefits are, how was that delivered to people?
Well, so it's all available. I mean, it went up online as soon as we produced it, and it's obviously cascaded. The NHS providers themselves would be aware of it so that they could use it. But actually, certainly in the stages where we were inviting people in through the national programme, the leaflet was designed to go out with the letter inviting people to make an appointment, or in the initial stages, perhaps giving them an appointment to come forward for vaccination for that first cohort. So we actually worked with the NHS, printed the leaflets so that it went out with the letters.
And what about after the point of vaccination? What input did you have into making people aware of conditions that they may need to look out for, or symptoms they may need to look out for?
So we also produce a leaflet, and again, it's our normal approach. It's called What to Expect After Vaccination, and it's something that can be handed out at the time someone gets a vaccine that perhaps tells them what to do if they get symptoms, to take paracetamol or whatever, and also how to report symptoms. And if there is a particular concern about a safety signal, we might put specific things to look out for. For example, headache, for example, chest pain, those sorts of things, if there is something that we are particularly concerned has been related to that particular vaccine.
Within the Green Book, there was, throughout the vaccination programme and still is, guidance on the principle of consent, which includes the requirement for people to be informed about the process of vaccination, the benefits, the risks, including extremely rare potential side effects or indeed common and not so serious side effects. Are you confident that the information provided by PHE and UKHSA to patients, taken in conjunction with some of the legally required documentation that the MHRA were responsible for, that they satisfied that requirement, that people were receiving the vaccine having been informed properly and able to consent to what they were receiving?
Well, I would hope so, but that's not the. I mean, the leaflet isn't the only thing. Obviously, it's a process, and everybody was supposed to see a healthcare professional so that they could discuss either any specific issues about their individual health that might affect the safety of the vaccine, which is really important, as well as asking any questions about things that are there. I mean, the extent of literature that there is about safety, there's a lot of it, and some people may not be able to manage to read that as well or take it in as well. So obviously that potential for a conversation is a really important element, and I think ensuring that healthcare workers are also able to answer questions of the public is another element of that. So as I think we always say, consent is a process, not a one-off event, and there's a range of things, but I think the leaflets are one way that we help to ensure that they are consistent, people are getting consistent advice, and that advice is aligned with the clinical information as well.
I want to move on now to ask you about a very particular issue that arose within the safety of vaccines in respect of blood clots and updates on information available to the public about possible safety signals and about blood clots. We looked at this yesterday with Professor Dame Jenny Harries, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, having already looked at this document, but just to get your view on it and to understand what it might tell us about the systems that were in place at the time to inform the public about safety issues. If we could have up on screen INQ 000528432, please. This is an email chain between you and others in April 2021. It's addressed from you to the particular email we're looking at, from you to Professor Dame Jenny Harries. To be aware, you say, I've requested clearance to change NHS website, which is currently out of date, for information on clots. Sort of me against DHSC comms, CMO in between, sub going off to Secretary of State. And you explained that it wasn't updated after the last MHRA press release because you were waiting for updated advice. It dragged on, and your concern was that the current content linked to out-of-date MHRA story with bad advice about presenting, and it implied incorrectly you had to have 4 days of a headache rather than a headache starting more than 4 days after the vaccine. Thank you. We can take that down and go to the next page, please. This is another email in the chain where you say, FYI, this sub follows my request to update information on the NHS website. And you go on to say, all against me, but I feel obliged to push. And we can take that document down entirely now. Thank you. There was also a meeting on I think the 2nd of April 2021 with the parties that you've mentioned there about how to update the information that was going to go out to the public. Can you remember how your concerns on this occasion were responded to, how this was resolved?
Well, in the end, the DHSC Deputy Director made a decision to put the question to Secretary of State and described my concerns, and the Secretary of State decided that it was okay to wait until after the bank holiday weekend and for everything to go out in a single suite. My proposal had been, I knew there was going to be a lot of information going out immediately after the bank holiday, but I was keen to change the NHS website in particular because of that slightly confusing advice about days of headache, so that people could get appropriate treatment as early as possible. That was my concern. So that was how it was resolved.
Dr. Ramsey, I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't follow why a decision of this kind, if there's wrong advice on a website, what has to go to the Secretary of State? Why did you have to get your concern dealt with at that level?
Well, because I had tried to make an appeal to the DHSC comms, but they were very clear that they wanted everything to go out in a coordinated way and didn't want this to be changed.
So you had to go to the top?
So basically that was the decision, yeah.
Was this an isolated incident, or were there any other incidents where you had concerns about public information on safety being accurate?
I think this was there were others where perhaps it took a while to, but generally they were resolved. I think this was a particularly difficult one because it was just before the bank holiday. So therefore there was this concern that we had 4 days. It was a 4-day bank holiday, which is quite unusual. So we had a slightly longer delay. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I was always trying to make sure that everything got out as soon as possible. And there was always that balance with the communications professionals wanting to make sure everything was aligned so that we were able to give a completely clear message, which of course is very important. So I appreciate there's a balance, but I think this was the only one where I was so significantly concerned that we took it upwards. Yeah.
You spoke earlier about the advantages of cooperation and coordination when it came to safety surveillance, but on messaging, does this chain of emails or this incident highlight that potentially there were too many entities, organisations involved in public messaging on safety and not one with a definitive say? Or conversely, actually, was it a good thing that there were lots of eyes on what was happening? I
mean, I think a decision was made that the messaging would be managed sort of centrally in the Cabinet Office stroke DHSC. So I was that was fine having one message, because it's very important not to have inconsistent messaging, because that confuses people more. So I think I have no problem with that, and I think what is good is that there is clinical input into that, and that the clinical expertise is reflected, which it was, even though at the end of the day, subsequently, my opinion was sort of overruled in terms of the timing. But certainly, when the messaging went out, the tone of the messaging was completely, I was completely behind making sure that the balance of risks and benefits were going to be reflected, hopefully, as accurately as possible.
And what about from a patient or member of the public perspective? We've heard about these different sources of information about the risks and benefit of vaccines, the process of vaccination. Do you think, on reflection, it might have been good to have a central source for the public to access information, so they're not going between the NHSE website, the PHE website, a letter they may have received in the post? Might that be something to reflect on for the future?
Yeah, I actually personally think a single sort of website or a single authoritative source of information on immunisation would be helpful. We did used to have one prior to 2010, but now it's devolved into either the NHS website or the DHSE website. But of course, I do want to remind you that it's not just about websites. It's about the whole process where people talk to their health professionals. And so having a consistent message is the key thing there. And I do think we managed to achieve that, but I do think it would be easier if people could find everything in one place. So I think it would facilitate that, people accessing information that's aligned and authoritative.
I want to move on now to a different topic entirely, that of prioritisation and PHE and UK HSA's role in that. You've already confirmed that there was the provision of secretariat support for JCVI. Did PHE at least in the early stages, always often attend JCVI committee and subcommittee meetings as observers? Was that a role?
Yes, there was always a number of us, myself as the medical advisor, invariably would be there. Yes, our secretariat also, who work in my team, were also invariably there.
And an active advisory role, including producing reports, for example, citing scientific or surveillance data.
Exactly.
Yeah. Risk of mortality, for example, PHE produced information about that prior to prioritisation decisions being made in order to inform.
Absolutely. Yeah, our job would be to try and source as much information as possible to support JCVI decision making.
The inquiry's heard about one particular part of the prioritisation process, and that is that the system for deciding who falls into which cohort. Cohort 6 in particular appears to have been a tricky area in terms of definitions and who was going to be included. I just want to ask you for your perspective on this, particularly as the person responsible for the Green Book. In February 2021, there was an issue about unpaid carers. and a point of discussion between DHSC, OCMO, and you as the person holding the pen, if you like, on the Green Book. Effectively, at the end of December, JCVI had included within Cohort 6 those who are in receipt of carer's allowance or the main carer of an elderly or disabled person whose welfare may be at risk if the carer falls ill. And then in February 2021, that definition was changed to include those who are the sole or primary carer for an elderly or disabled person who is at increased risk of Covid-19 mortality and therefore clinically vulnerable, in addition to those who are in receipt of carer's allowance. So we may not need to get into the minutiae of why that happened, but I provide it for context because it's an example of an interaction between the advice coming from the JCVI about who should be included in a cohort and then that definition being refined because it's a definition which requires reference to the Green Book and the Green Book definition being ironed out, if you like, between a number of bodies. What was the procedure, please, for changing or deciding on definitions in the Green Book which might directly impact who was going to be included in a particular priority cohort, such as unpaid carers?
The Green Book already, the Green Book really is this sort of clinical document. It's designed for the clinicians, but obviously it reflects policy decisions that have been made on the basis of JCVI recommendations. So it's a difficult balance as to how much detail is in the Green Book, but primarily the Green Book I see as about the principle behind the prioritisation, to explain that without necessarily operationalising every single detail. And obviously, in terms of the number of people eligible and whether there's enough vaccine to vaccinate them and where they, and that those sorts of decisions are really policy decisions which are made by government or by ministers. So, for example, the definition that we had of carers in that chapter was exactly the same as had been in the flu chapter for the last 10 or 15 years, probably. I wasn't expecting it to need to be changed. It has to be generic enough to cover the 4 different devolved administrations who may have different legislation, different mechanisms for identifying and even understanding who their carers are. And DH took the responsibility of defining what a healthcare worker was for England, including other elements like caring. But I was asked actually by the NHS in particular to further clarify particularly the clinical aspects of who was being cared for in order to avoid introducing unnecessary inequalities and also to be so that people could self-declare, so that if they came forward to self-declare, that could be tested against the definition of the person they were caring for. So that's why that additional information was added. It wouldn't normally be required in most of our programmes because there is a clinician initiating the activity, but obviously with a centrally managed thing like the COVID programme, they wanted more consistency, I think.
Was it the case, and it's a concern that is held by some disabled people's organisations, was it a concern that operational considerations crept in to the definitions within the Green Book, but by which I mean there was a desire to make that particular cohort smaller so that it wasn't unmanageable, and that might have been why the definition of unpaid carers in particular was narrowed?
No, I don't really see it particularly as being narrowed. Actually, I see it as big. The main concern was about equity, making equity and consistency so that we could make the offer equal and consistent. And also, really importantly, that we wouldn't be taking vaccine away from individuals who themselves were at very high risk of dying from COVID. So at the early stages, we didn't have enough vaccine to do everyone in one go. So if we had given more vaccines to more carers, we could potentially have had less vaccine to give to the patients themselves who were at high risk of mortality. So it was part of the prioritisation, I think, just to clarify and make it more consistent across the 4 countries.
I want to deal now with data, with monitoring uptake. So monitoring, by which I don't mean surveillance of safety issues, but how many people are taking up the vaccine offer and who are they. That type of monitoring was the responsibility of PHE and UKHSA, was it not?
Well, yes, but again, in collaboration, and our main data source was the National Immunisation Monitoring System, which was established by NHS Digital, subsequently NHS England. But we worked very closely with them, and we primarily are the agency that takes the role at a national level for producing these kind of statistics and publishing them. That's our normal role.
If we may just look again at the vaccine surveillance strategy very briefly, it's 477132. Thank you. Page 6, please. Which sets out the models for reporting. At 3.1, if we could zoom in, thank you. This is the existing systems of reporting. It's pointed out there most vaccines are delivered via primary care, and uptake data are extracted automatically from the GP record systems. But if we could then go to the next paragraph, 3.2, we have here that, as you've just mentioned, the National Immunisation Management System, or NIMS, which captures demographic data, GP data and employee data. Rather, that is what feeds into NIMS to identify vaccine-eligible groups. Thank you. We can take that down. There was an evaluation, was there not, a UKHSA-led paper published in December of 2022, which recognised some points for improvement with that system, including better cross-organisational sharing of data, easing of the data entry burden on immunisation sites. Can you tell us a little more about that, please, how that was hoped to be improved?
Well, so I mean, I think there has been a lot of improvement since, but it was a new system at the time. It was a game changer, a really good overall intervention. So we shouldn't miss that. But yes, I think there was a rather clumsy way of the data getting in, and we wanted obviously people to be able to enter data, not for the people who were giving the vaccines to be able to get the data into the system with relatively little overhead in terms of data entry capacity. So point of care apps were produced by the NHS and they've been rolled out since, and there are more of them. And I think that has reduced that burden. But that was an initial concern, that there was a need potentially for more data entry than would be required.
Was there also emerging from that report the identified issue of individuals who didn't have NHS numbers or didn't have GP registration not being sufficiently monitored?
Yes, I mean, we were aware that they wouldn't, that by definition, if you were making your database from the GP system, you were going to miss out people who weren't in the GP system. But again, that was flagged, and I believe over the first few months of the programme, various interventions were introduced to allow people to get vaccinated without an NHS number, or to develop have an NHS number at the point they came for a vaccine, rather than having to have it in advance. But obviously they would have missed out on the invitation, for example, if they weren't on the system. So that is an ongoing issue, I think, for the whole health service, really, about how we access people who aren't registered.
Turning then to that issue of monitoring an unequal uptake and identifying those gaps in coverage, did PHE produce papers before even vaccines began to be delivered to people, highlighting, and I'm talking here in particular about a November 2020 paper on vaccine and health inequalities, considerations for prioritisation and implementation. Pre-rollout identified the need for identification of vulnerable groups, the importance of recognising that there are gaps where the most vulnerable groups may not be registered with a GP and not have an NHS number. It appears from what was recognised in that report that this was a foreseeable difficulty. Would you agree?
Yes.
And was it quite a long-standing problem?
Very long-standing, yes. I mean, I think, and I think the NHS were well aware of it as well, but it's not a trivial thing to correct, obviously. Yes, we just felt it was important to flag that because there were a lot of people, both JCVI and people working in the programme, who maybe hadn't been as embedded in immunisation as we had. And so that was why we flagged those potential issues to make sure that that was considered in the implementation and rollout.
And was there also an important paper in January of 2021, COVID vaccination in inclusion health populations, which focused specifically on those groups who it was emerging had lower uptake and certainly had reason to think would have lower uptake, so ethnic minority groups, vulnerable groups such as migrant groups, Gypsy, Roma, traveller groups, homeless people, to use just a few examples. Did that report make clear that one of the key considerations is that healthcare has to be taken in some circumstances to people, that it isn't enough to simply set up mass vaccination centres, expect people to walk into their local GP and wait for them to come, that kind of model isn't going to engage those vulnerable groups.
Yes, and I think, and again, we're aware of that from our routine programmes, but I mean, there were some additional barriers with this particular programme that made that more challenging. One of the issues being the product itself coming in multi-dose vials, not being able to be moved. The Pfizer product initially wasn't able to physically be moved and then used. And so, in theory, you could go to an outreach clinic with a box of 176 doses and only use 50 of them, and potentially, therefore, wasting the rest because it couldn't be moved and used again. So there were very real barriers very early on, and therefore, it took some time for those outreach models to start to get implemented, particularly the advent of the AZ vaccine, which was more flexible in its storage requirements.
Once that ability was there to deliver more flexibly, can you explain an overview what PHE did and UKHSA did to try and reach those communities identified in these important papers?
So most of that work was really led by the NHS, I would say. PHE obviously very important in pointing out and helping hopefully to monitor it at a national level, but also at that time we had local teams, screening and immunisation leads who were embedded in the NHS. Now they would be people who would be normally working on immunisation programmes with other stakeholders at a local level, directors of public health, community groups, etc. And they would be working with the local NHS to work out what delivery models might be suitable for people, for example, in homelessness, in the justice system, which would require things like taking the vaccine to those individuals.
Can I just touch on the issue of local collaboration, and by which I mean collaborating from the centre with local authorities who are best placed potentially to identify gaps in coverage locally and to reach those communities. Were you aware of concerns set out by on behalf of the local government associations that data which would prove important in identifying where gaps in coverage were locally was not reaching local authorities in the early days of the pandemic as quickly as it should have been or could have been, and that when it came, it wasn't sufficiently detailed? Were you aware of those concerns at the time?
Well, we were aware of their requests for data. I think I think there's a level of expectation, I guess, as to what was realistic in terms of what could be provided. As I said, the system was being established at the time, and there are very strict governance issues around named data, for example. So I think we made a lot of efforts to to provide data to them through our platforms, secure platforms we developed for COVID, actually, for sharing data on COVID disease. But I think the NHS was primarily responsible for managing that data, and I think it would be through their local networks that they would be sharing with directors of public health. That would be the appropriate mechanism. And I think there's quite a lot of this discussed in the NHS evidence statement.
I just have one final topic to cover with you, and it is a brief one, and that's the issue of therapeutics. Was UKHSA's remit in respect of therapeutics to monitor for evidence of emerging resistance, to produce reports on the effectiveness, in particular effectiveness against new strains of COVID?
So I think we had a role in monitoring variants, and some part of that role would be looking at the genetic changes in the virus that might affect therapeutics. So we would be flagging issues that might be of concern in terms of theoretical concerns about whether or not a product would work. So that was one of our roles, and we did produce reports on that, looking at potential resistance to antivirals, for example.
From your perspective in that area of work, were therapeutics and what was the work that you were doing on them, was it sufficiently prioritised in comparison to work that was being done on vaccines? And were there any delays in that work which were problematic?
So I think it was prioritised in terms of our role. I think we had a much less central role to it because the policy decisions were being made in different groups. We weren't part of that decision-making process, so we were providing evidence to support that decision-making process. And some of that work involved laboratory work. Some of it involved that monitoring work I was talking about earlier, looking at different variants and what their implications may be. So I think we did a lot of work on variants. That's very well noted. I think there is some concern in some of the witness statements about a delay in some of our laboratory testing. I would just point out, as my understanding, that work was commissioned by the manufacturer, not by government or any of the committees making those decisions. And I don't think our understanding is that we provided the data relatively rapidly after we were asked for it, noting that it's in a kind of evolving situation. There were different variants emerging, and we were having to do additional testing over the period of when some of those products were being considered by those expert groups, etc.
Dr. Ramsey, thank you very much. Those are all the questions that I have for you.
Thank you. Just a few more questions for you, Dr. Ramsey. Ms. Knight, who usually hides over that way. There she is.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramsey. I represent the Migrants Primary Care Access Group. And there is a Public Health England briefing note that's exhibited to your witness statement from the Behavioural Science and Insight Unit, and that's entitled Barriers and Facilitators to Covid-19 Vaccination Uptake. It's INQ 004777091, and it's dated September 2021. And you refer to it in your witness statement under the section in relation to unequal uptake of vaccine and understanding of disparities to uptake, and also in the section relating to vaccine hesitancy and countering misinformation. So at page 17 of that document, specifically referring to barriers to COVID-19 vaccination for adults from ethnic minority groups, and following a number of other issues there relating to lack of reliable information, misinformation, language and trust, it then goes on specifically and expressly to identify that fear of immigration enforcement and data sharing between healthcare bodies and Home Office deterred migrant uptake of the vaccine. And there's a specific section under a subheading, fear of persecution, that's how it's expressed there, that this has been reported by undocumented migrants and refugees who are either not aware of this information regarding the absence of documentation checks at vaccine sites, or who do not know whether to trust this information. And so I just wanted to ask you, what, if any, specific and tailored interventions were made in response to this evidence aimed at migrants?
So that report, as you said, has a lot of information. That's just one element of it. I mean, that was produced by our Behavioural Surveillance Insight Unit, I think it's called. And that was really mainly to support local collaboration, so through local directors of public health and our local screening and immunisation teams. So I would have expected that. I mean, that briefing note went out to those local teams to hopefully support them in understanding what the barriers might be in their area and how to address that. That is to say, however, that's not a new phenomenon. I think it's something we had found previously, looking at Eastern European migrants, of people's perception of what might happen if they came forward for vaccination and whether or not they could register has always been a potential barrier. So it's something we've been aware of for a while and been working with migrant groups. I'm not sure if we've worked with the people you're representing yourselves, but I'm sure people within the agency have at some point touched on those areas.
So you say you would have hoped. So were you able to say whether it was effective and successful?
No, I mean, I think not, because I think we've already touched on some of the issues about data. I mean, if those teams are not, I mean, apart from sort of soft intelligence on the ground that people were coming forward, which I think there is some of that in the NHS witness statements, I don't think there's any formalised data because, by definition, those groups may not be on our data system. So that's one of the weaknesses and one of the ongoing things I think we really need to continue to address in the future.
Thank you. Just to confirm, you said in your statement it was shared with a range of local and national government stakeholders in order to inform efforts to improve its uptake in specific communities.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Snow. Yeah. Mr Jacobs, can you see Mr Jacobs at the back there?
I can, yes. Not very well.
No,
but...
I think you need...
Back to the same problem. I think that's a bit better, isn't it? Hello, Dr. Ramsey. Good afternoon. I act for the Gypsy Traveller community, and my client is the Traveller Movement, and which represents the 3 Roma, Gypsy, and Traveller communities in the United Kingdom, and I'll call them GRT for the sake of convenience. Did you hear the evidence of Yvonne McNamara, who's the CEO of the Traveller movement, on the 16th of January? That was last Thursday.
I didn't hear it, but I have looked at the documents very briefly, yeah. I'm
grateful. She highlighted that there's been a historic problem that the GRT traveller community ethnicity is not recorded by institutions. For example, GRT are not recorded in the NHS data dictionary. And you refer to this issue at paragraph 7.3 of your statement. No need to turn it up. And you refer to a November 2020 PHE authorised paper, which noted pre-rollout that membership of certain groups is often not recorded in routine healthcare record systems. And I think Ms Stevenson took you to this issue at about 12:45, so about a quarter of an hour ago. And you also refer to GRT at paragraph 7.5 of your statement as being one of the inclusion health groups, which is an umbrella term for people who are socially excluded, tend to have very poor health outcomes, and who are considered to be at high risk of missing out on vaccination. And I think Ms Stevenson took you to that around about 10-1. So I have 3 questions for you. Firstly, did you recognise during the pandemic how this lack of data capture relating to the GRT communities could potentially impact on their vaccine uptake?
Well, I think we did recognise it because that was partly why that paper was written prior to the programme, and I believe we held a workshop with the Gypsy Roma Traveller community with about 150 people and worked with your organisations to produce some guidance to try and facilitate that. That didn't solve the data problem, but hopefully would have helped to improve the actual delivery by making it clear that people were eligible for vaccination and that travellers could could be registered with GPs. Advice was produced for GPs, advice was produced for the community itself, and advice was produced for various other elements of the health service to try and facilitate that. We still don't, as far as I know, have good data to show how effective that might be, and that is something long term we would very much appreciate. As you say, then we've been aware that that community in particular misses out on other vaccines in the past.
Really, what I wanted to sort of follow up on there was there an awareness that the lack of data capture was an issue in relation to vaccine uptake in this group? For example, if a group is statistically invisible, then they can't be looked after and planned for by the medical institutions. Was that something that was at the forefront of thinking at the time?
I don't know whether it was the forefront of everyone's thinking. I think it's very much part of our overall view of the inequalities picture and the inclusion groups picture, that this was one group where we know not only were they less likely to access vaccines, they were also potentially at higher risk because of underlying comorbidities, underlying socio-demographic issues. So I think we were very well aware of that as an organisation. And again, it comes back to how we would try and influence that. So it would be mainly at a local level, because it's obviously at a local level that people will be aware of where their traveller sites are, etc., and what facilities and services there are for those traveller sites, and how those have been funded and maintained over a long period of time.
That's helpful. I just have two other questions. We've seen examples in the evidence of limited local initiatives to engage the GRT community, for example, at Appleby Horse Fair, but we haven't seen in the evidence any concerted effort at national level to ensure the inclusion of GRT in a systematic manner. And my question for you is, notwithstanding what you've said, but given this lack of data recognition of GRT and the knowledge that GRT faced health inequalities and social exclusion, what specific efforts were made at national level, not locally, but at a national level, to ensure the targeting of GRT communities in the vaccination programs?
I'm personally not aware of specific, but other than holding that national workshop, which wasn't about data, that was about trying to make sure the guidance was as facilitative as possible. I'm not aware of anything specifically at a national level, and I'm not entirely sure of the technical issues that stop that data collection, but I'm very happy to take that forward, and I'm very happy that we would look to a more sustainable solution to ensuring that this community in particular is able to access vaccinations of all types, not just COVID.
Well, that leads me to my final question. In respect of this data desert, if you like, that was raised by Ms McNamara and others in this inquiry, what actions to address that will be made that you're aware of in future pandemics?
Well, I don't think this is just an issue for the pandemic. I think it's an issue for all time, and I do think we do need sustainable solutions to reaching out to that community in order to ensure that they are getting access to vaccination and to other healthcare interventions and other prevention measures, and obviously engagement to improve trust in that community so that they are more able to come forward. Vaccines are a medical intervention. I think it's very important that people are engaged with the health service in order to receive those, that it isn't just given as a separate thing. So I do think it's part of the overall reach out of the whole health service to that community. That would be my kind of advice. I have relatively limited leverage across the whole system, of course.
Of course.
Thank you very much, Ms Jacobs. I'm sorry, the stenographer's had the toughest of tough mornings,
Of course,
so we're going to have to leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your help, Dr Ramsey. Extremely grateful to you.
Thank you.
And we will take a break now, and I'll come back at 2:05.
All right.